Carl Russell knew the streets of Liverpool well. He wasn't just some random face on the block. People knew who he was. His name carried weight in parts of Liverpool. By the time 2019 rolled around, Carl knew the dangers that came with being a known figure. His history was long and eventful: prison stretches, violent run-ins, and plenty of unfinished business that had stacked up over the years. He had been in and out of prison more times than most people. Among those stretches was his time in HMP Thorn Cross, a Category D prison, which was supposed to be for low-risk offenders. But for someone like Carl, prison wasn't a place of reform. It was just part of the cycle. He'd been serving time for crimes ranging from robbery to violent offenses. His reputation in the criminal world meant he wasn't seen as just another inmate doing his time quietly. That kind of reputation doesn't fade, inside or out. The streets have a long memory, and Carl's name carried weight. When you've built up a history of crime, you're bound to make enemies. And Carl had plenty. Every job, every prison stint, every beef, it all added up. By 2010, Carl had already stepped on enough toes to make him a target. That year, the streets made it clear: someone wanted Carl dead. He was shot in a targeted attack. He took a bullet, but he survived. The shooting left its mark, both physically and mentally. In a world where life is cheap and hits are common, surviving a gunshot is no small feat. Most people don't get up from that. But Carl did. He came out alive, and that only added to his reputation. Still, nobody survives a hit without knowing the consequences. If someone comes for you once, they're likely to come again. Carl knew he wasn't out of the woods. Surviving the 2010 shooting put Carl in a different category. It was a badge of honor, but also a reminder that he was living on borrowed time. The streets had their own code, and he had been marked. He knew it. Once you're in the game as deep as he was, there's no walking away clean. His enemies wouldn't forget, and he wasn't naive enough to think the bullet was the end of it. It was just the beginning. He didn't slow down after the shooting. He kept moving, kept hustling. In and out of trouble, he continued living the life that had made him both respected and hated. The ones who wanted him gone were still out there, and in the criminal world, time doesn't heal old wounds, it just makes them fester. By 2019, Carl was still active, still involved in the streets. He'd been back inside HMP Thorn Cross, on another stretch that felt more like a pause than a stop. But the reality was clear. Carl's past wasn't done with him. The bullet from 2010 had been a warning shot, and everyone knew it. Carl Russell was a marked man. It wasn't a question of if the streets would catch up to him, but when. HMP Thorn Cross is a Category D prison where inmates like Carl could work their way toward reintegration. But for someone with Carl's background, day release wasn't just a way to prepare for freedom. It was an opportunity for others to make their move. On September 23, 2019, Carl was granted day release. It was supposed to be a routine thing, just a day out, a chance to see family, and get a taste of life on the outside. But Carl wasn't any regular inmate. His name still carried weight on the streets, and his enemies knew where to find him. It wasn't hard to track him, especially since day release followed a strict schedule. Those watching didn't need to guess where Carl would be. They had the information. Someone on the outside had been keeping tabs, and when you're in as deep as Carl was, you don't get many places to hide. Carl's day release was the perfect setup. The hitman didn't need to rush or make mistakes. With Carl on a limited time frame, there were only so many places he could go. The hitman likely knew Carl's movements for days, maybe weeks, before they made their move. Information flows quickly in the underworld, and it's no secret that plenty of people inside and outside the system can be bought. His release date wasn't a mystery to the right people, and the ones looking to finish the job had all the time in the world to prepare. Carl probably thought this day would be like any other, see his girlfriend, visit his mum in Belle Vale. But the streets don't forget, and neither do enemies. Whether it was from a tip-off or pure observation, the people who wanted him dead knew his routine. And on that day, they were ready. His day release became the perfect trap. He stepped out thinking he had a few hours of freedom. The setup was complete. The streets always collect their debts, and Carl Russell's time was about to run out. On October 7th, 2018, Carl Russell stepped out into the world on day release. It seemed like just another routine day, his chance to breathe in a bit of freedom, even if just for a few hours. That morning, Carl left the confines of prison to spend some time with his family. But for Carl, freedom was always an illusion. Someone had been waiting for this exact moment. Alongside his girlfriend, they made their way to his family home in Belle Vale, Liverpool, just after 11 a.m. The pair arrived on Cornwood Close, a quiet residential street, and parked up outside his mother's house. This was supposed to be just a quick stop, just enough to see his family before heading back to the prison. But as soon as Carl stepped out of the car, the streets came calling. Unbeknownst to Carl, someone had been watching. This was a calculated assassination. The gunman approached on a bicycle, blending in with the morning hustle of the neighborhood. He wore a high-visibility jacket, an outfit designed to keep suspicions low. In a residential area, seeing someone on a bike in a high-vis jacket wouldn't raise suspicion. But this wasn't your ordinary cyclist. Carl stepped out of the passenger seat, unaware that he was walking into a death trap. As soon as he stood outside the car, the hitman closed in. Armed with a 9mm semi-automatic handgun, the gunman opened fire. Multiple shots rang out in broad daylight. Carl was hit several times. The bullets were aimed for the kill. This was no warning, no mistake. This was the end. His girlfriend, standing nearby, could only watch in horror as the gunman made his escape, pedaling away on his bike. It was over in seconds. The high-vis jacket and the bike made for the perfect getaway disguise. Easy to slip into the ordinary, easy to disappear. The shooter melted back into the streets. The paramedics arrived, but there was nothing they could do. Carl Russell was pronounced dead at the scene. Merseyside police launched an immediate investigation. From the outset, the detectives knew they were dealing with a carefully planned Gangland-style hit, but solving this case wouldn't be easy. The streets had already gone silent. No one was coming forward. The initial stages of the investigation were methodical. The murder occurred in broad daylight in a residential neighborhood, so the police started with the basics: door-to-door inquiries, CCTV footage from local cameras, and appeals to the public. Detectives had a clear starting point. The gunman was spotted on CCTV, cycling up to Carl wearing a high-visibility jacket and escaping the scene in the same manner. But while the images gave police a lead, they didn't bring them much closer to the killer. The cyclist's face remained obscured, and no identifying features stood out. There was no rush of witnesses to help the investigation. The code of silence, ingrained in the streets of Liverpool, kicked in almost immediately. The police knew this too well. In Gangland murders, information is hard to come by, and even those who knew details weren't willing to break rank. Fear of retaliation hung over the community, making people hesitant to speak, even with a £20,000 reward offered for any information leading to an arrest. Detectives arrested 3 men in connection with the murder. There was hope that someone might slip up, that someone might give them the break they needed. But these arrests led to dead ends. All 3 suspects were released without charge. The silence from the streets was deafening, and with no one talking, the investigation began to stall. In their desperation for a breakthrough, Merseyside police made several public appeals, releasing footage of the high-vis-clad cyclist and urging anyone with information to come forward. But no one stepped up. The police knew that they wouldn't get much cooperation. The investigation, once full of urgency, began to lose momentum. Even now, years after the murder, Carl Russell's case remains unsolved. The £20,000 reward still stands, but the streets haven't broken their silence. Carl's enemies, whoever they are still out there, and the investigation remains open but cold. In the end, the silence that followed Carl's murder became one of the barriers to finding his killer. Carl Russell had a history that made him both respected and feared. By the time he was gunned down, he had built up a long list of rivals, and in the world he moved in, grudges don't die easily. His execution was no random act. It was planned, precise, and personal. But the real question remains: who wanted Carl dead, and why? His past offers plenty of clues. He wasn't a small-time criminal. He had built up a reputation through his involvement in a range of crimes. Every time he was in and out of prison, he made enemies, both inside and outside the system. For years, Carl had been involved in the world of organized crime in Liverpool, a city where gang-related violence is an ever-present reality. His name was known in the streets, and when you're a known figure, you attract attention, sometimes the kind that comes with a price on your head. One of the most significant markers of Carl's life was the 2010 shooting he survived. Someone had already tried to kill him once, but he escaped that hit with his life. That shooting wasn't just a one-off. It was likely tied to deeper gang feuds or unfinished business. Surviving a hit often only delays the inevitable, and Carl knew better than anyone that walking away once doesn't mean you're free. His survival may have made him a bigger target. Someone still had a score to settle, and they weren't going to let him walk away a second time. Liverpool's Gangland is built on networks of alliances and rivalries, and Carl was deeply embedded in that world. The gangs in the city often engage in territorial disputes and clashes over drug supply chains. Carl's involvement in organized crime would have put him right in the middle of these conflicts. And it's likely that his death was the result of one such feud. Perhaps he crossed the wrong people, or maybe old business from his time in prison followed him to the streets. Carl had a reputation, and in a world where every action has a consequence, it's possible that his murder was retaliation for something he had done. In gangland culture, revenge killings are common. A robbery gone wrong, a deal that fell apart, or even a personal betrayal could have been the spark that led to Carl's execution. Someone wanted to settle the score, and they made sure that this time, Carl didn't get away. The planning of the hit suggests that this wasn't impulsive, it was well organized, with the killer knowing exactly where Carl would be and when. That kind of information doesn't just fall into anyone's lap. It's likely that Carl's movements were being watched for some time before the hit. Someone had been keeping tabs on him, waiting for the right moment to strike. It could have been a rival gang, an old enemy, or even someone close to Carl. In the criminal underworld, loyalty only runs so deep, and betrayal is always lurking around the corner. Another possibility is that Carl's death was linked to debts, either financial or personal. In a world where drug money, loans, and favors keep the gears turning, falling behind on a debt can be deadly. Carl may have owed the wrong people, or maybe he had burned a bridge that couldn't be repaired. Whatever the reason, the hit was the ultimate form of payback. At the end of the day, his murder was no coincidence. It was calculated, carried out by someone who wanted to make sure Carl didn't get a second chance. Whether it was an old gang feud, a personal vendetta, or a debt that needed settling, one thing is clear. Carl's past caught up with him, and the streets decided it was time to collect. Carl Russell's life was a story of survival, always looking over his shoulder until the streets finally claimed him. Behind the hard edges and headlines, there was still a man who didn't get to see another day, another life, cut short. For more raw and real crime stories, hit the like button and subscribe. Until the next episode, stay alert and stay safe.